Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. I'm delighted to welcome a brand new guest to The Tom Woods Show here on episode 2508, and that's Kyle Anzalone, who is opinion editor at antiwar.com. And I thought to round out the week, we'd do a little bit of a foreign policy potpourri. So Kyle, welcome back. Well, I'll see my habit of welcoming people back. I have a brand new guest, so welcome to the show for the first time.
Tom, thank you so much for having me.
Now, I was just reviewing with Kyle that he holds the position that until 2019, our friend Scott Horton held. And Scott was working on his book, Fool's Errand, and he said to Eric Garris, who kind of runs the whole thing, he said, I can't be opinion editor at antiwar.com anymore. I got to just focus on my book. And I guess Eric just lit into him like, what, are you crazy? I can't possibly do without you. You got to be out of your mind, whatever. And Scott said, no, I insist. I got a really good substitute. Really, oh, get out of here. So he insisted, you got to talk to Kyle for half an hour. And he said, and Eric did talk to him and came back and said to Scott, yeah, I love this guy. He's better than you. Go write your dumb book. So I thought, well, what the heck? Why have I not had Kyle on the show? So let's talk about a few things that are in the news. Now, by the time this airs, all right, it's several days past, but I mean, the big picture, unfortunately, rarely shifts all that much in U.S. foreign policy. You don't have to worry that peace is going to suddenly break out. These people have a vested interest in keeping it all going. But let's talk about the peace offer that Putin made and what it consisted of, and whether, now, of course, I'm sure people would consider this show to be Russian propaganda, and I'm a Russian asset who gets no check from the Russian government. But do you think it was reasonable? And as I say, what were the terms of it?
Yeah, Tom, and I was recently placed on the list of 400 individuals who spread Russian propaganda, the latest one by
Tetsly.ua.
Yeah, so always nice to be on a list with the likes of Daniel McAdams and Ron Paul and Rand Paul and others like that. Although there were some Israel firsters on that list as well, which was interesting. But on Friday, I guess this would have been the 15th, I believe, of June, Vladimir Putin came out and gave a press conference, and he laid out the potential ceasefire deal and then ultimately the end of the war in Ukraine. And the framework that he used for this agreement was the Istanbul framework from April of 2022, when Ukraine and Russia were very close to ending the war within the first 2 months before Western leaders like Boris Johnson and Joe Biden convinced Zelensky that the Ukrainians would be better off if, rather than signing this deal with Russia and agreeing to neutrality and non-nuclearization, so they would never possess nuclear weapons, but rather than to fight and try to drive Russia out, not only of eastern Ukraine, but also the Crimean Peninsula. And so this was always a fool's errand, but the Ukrainians went for it anyway. And so on Friday, what Vladimir Putin said was, Ukraine's going to have to recognize the realities of this war. And those realities are that Russian forces now control 80 to 90% of 4 Ukrainian regions, and Russia held what they called elections and then officially annexed those 4 regions. Those are the 2 regions of the Donbass, Donetsk and Luhansk, and then Zaporizhia and Kherson in the south. And those kind of sit above the Crimean Peninsula and also along the Sea of Azov. And so I think those are seen as fairly strategic by Russia. But Russia is saying they're willing to withdraw from the north of the country and eventually hand back Kharkiv to the Ukrainians. So that would be significant. Russia also said that the Western countries will have to take sanctions off of Russia, or the Western countries, so US and UK and all these nations will have to remove sanctions on Russia. But then he's willing to end the war if Ukraine will agree to a neutral status and non-nuclearization. So this is an interesting proposal from the Russians. They certainly have a capability right now to continue to advance and take more territory in Ukraine. But Putin seems at this point to believe that he could get more at the negotiating table rather than actually waging war.
Now, of course, it was immediately rejected by Ukraine. And of course, I'm, no doubt the U.S. government has no interest in it. So as far as you know, is the U.S. government's position that basically there is no negotiation, that we just go back to prior to February 2022, and that's the non-negotiable demand? Is that what the position is?
So also this past weekend, Ukraine held a peace summit in Switzerland where, funny enough, they had a peace conference where Russia wasn't even invited to. And also Joe Biden skipped it to attend a fundraiser in California. So that was kind of interesting as well. But at this peace summit, the U.S. Was represented there by Kamala Harris. And we signed on to a thing that says, to end this war, Russia will have to withdraw from all Ukrainian territory, including the Crimean Peninsula, as well as Putin standing trial for war crimes and paying Ukraine war reparations. So there is a proposal in the West to end the war. It's just completely unrealistic and something Russia will never agree to.
Doesn't this seem like a bit of a pattern in U.S. history, that the negotiating position is, at least let's say over the past 40 years, is to have a position that everybody knows the other side couldn't possibly accept, and then just belligerently insist on it, and then portray yourself as the force for peace, but not ever really proposing anything plausible.
Right. That's exactly right, Tom. And that's essentially how we got here in 2024 from the end of the Cold War in 1991, when realistically, there was no reason for confrontation between Russia and the West. That was the world I was born into, where I didn't have to worry about nuclear weapons anymore or nuclear warfare between the U.S. and Russia, because we didn't have hostilities. The evil Soviets were gone, and now these Russians were reasonable people that we could deal with. And we kept expanding NATO towards Russia's border and moving our military forces closer and closer to Russia's border. And Russia kept warning, especially from 2008 on, that if you continue to do this, this is going to create a conflict. We can't have NATO expand all the way into Ukraine. And yet they continued to do that. And in 2001, Joe Biden made Ukraine a de facto NATO member. He was holding large-scale NATO war games in Ukraine. And the Russians were warning that this was being used to train Ukraine as a NATO army and then use it as a bulwark against Russia. And in some cases, you could point to that he fell into the trap of doing this, but it really did kind of play out that way, where the Ukrainian forces trained by NATO have used NATO weapons to wage war against Russia.
What's this stuff that we're reading in the, let's see, I don't remember which newspaper reported it, but you wrote a piece about Putin being willing to negotiate back in 2022. I mean, didn't we kind of know some of this before, and that it was stymied by either the U.S. and or the U.K.? I mean, is there anything new that we're learning?
There's really only a few new details that we're learning here, Tom. One, and I think probably the most significant and the most interesting, is Putin was even willing to negotiate on the Crimean Peninsula. The proposal from April 15th actually said that for the Russians are willing to allow Ukraine to continue to claim the Crimean Peninsula as their own territory. So I think that was a fairly significant concession on Putin's part. And it's also worth noting that 2022 agreement would have allowed the Donbass region and the southern regions of Ukraine to remain as independent but Ukrainian territory without Russian forces stationed there.
Now, I know the way the U.S. foreign policy establishment thinks. I don't know as much about the way foreign policy officials in European countries think, but I do know that they've generally been on the U.S. side of this. But I wonder if if there's any hint that any of them may be more inclined to try to negotiate just to end this whole thing, more so than the U.S. would, or would they just not want to cause problems with the U.S., or is there any way to know?
By and large, it seems that the rest of Europe is in line with what the U.S. is doing here. And in fact, some of the more reserved countries like Germany and France have taken more and more hostile positions throughout the war. And now the French president, Emmanuel Macron, who was the last Western leader to talk to Putin, has now suggested sending French troops into Ukraine. And we just had the big G7 summit last week, Tom, and there all these European leaders were celebrating around and talking about how, we're going to defeat Putin and all this other nonsense. So for the most part, they're on board. There are a couple European leaders, Robert Fico in Slovakia and Orban in Hungary, who are less enthusiastic about the conflict than some of the others. But by and large, the alliance is all on board.
Well, what do you say to people who say it's easy for you, people living in the U.S. or elsewhere, to say Ukraine should negotiate and end the war that way, when if it were your country and it was a matter of chunks of your territory either being taken or dominated by an overweening neighbor, you probably wouldn't go along with that. So why are you demanding that of Ukrainians?
Well, in this case, Tom, the Ukrainians really don't have much of a choice. Russia's a much more powerful army, and they're willing to wage a war of attrition here. And that's just something the Russians are going to win. And so, in some respect, the Ukrainians have to look at this realistically and understand that their country has been used by the West to provoke Russia for 3 decades now, and they're going to pay the price for that. Now, I do think there's a lot that particularly Washington, but NATO in general, could do to really de-escalate the situation here and probably get Russia to make some concessions towards Ukraine. We have the Aegis Ashore missile launchers in Poland and Romania, and Russia viewed these as a particular strategic threat because they could hold nuclear-tipped Tomahawk missiles if the West wanted to do that. And so we could agree to take those missile launchers out of those countries, and that would relieve a lot of Putin's concerns. We could also make agreements that we're not going to carry out war games in Western Europe. In 2021, the U.S. was leading war games with NATO countries where they were flying nuclear-capable bombers within 12 miles of Russian borders to, have the Russians activate their nuclear defense systems and things like that, so we could get radar signatures and try to figure out where those are. And these are highly provocative to Russia. The West has talked about expanding their U.S.'s nuclear sharing program, where we give nuclear weapons to other countries. So we store nuclear weapons in Italy, Germany, Turkey, and a few other European countries, but we talked about expanding that to Sweden and Poland. And so putting a cap on those programs would be something that Putin would be interested in. Returning to the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or the Anti-Ballistic Missile System Treaty, or the Open Skies Treaty that Presidents Bush and Obama withdrew from, are all things that the U.S. could do to reduce tensions on the European continent and make Putin less concerned about who controls eastern and southern Ukraine. But we're completely unwilling to do that. And that's a part of the reason why so many Ukrainians are getting killed right now.
Hey, everybody, let's take a minute to thank our sponsor, Persist SEO. If you are getting buried by your competition online, then build your brand, your reputation, and your lead flow with digital marketing by Persist SEO. If you are a small local business trying to compete against large companies in the service industry, then increase your visibility with Persist SEO. Or what if you have low or no leads coming in on a consistent basis? Well, then website search engine and conversion optimization can help move the needle to a more prosperous business model for you. Are you tired of cold calling and networking, meeting places getting shut down? Use your website as a lead generation engine. Or what if you're not showing up for your services in the search engines? Well, get found with Persist SEO's expert search engine optimization. All you have to do is call 770-580-3736 or visit them at ineedseo.help for a free website audit and consultation. That's 770-580-3736 or ineedseo.help. Let's say a little something about the situation in Gaza. Now, what is the deal with this pier that Biden said they were constructing that turns out to be a total stinker, and now it's not clear what's going to happen with it at all?
Yes, Tom. So this is, really unbelievable of a failure of a project on Biden's part. He announced this during his State of the Union address in March. It took months to assemble. And once it's been assembled, it's now had to been disassembled 3 times because it can't handle waves over 2 feet tall. So it's essentially in an area where 2 feet waves are not that uncommon. And so they haven't been able to maintain this thing for over a week at a time. Just a little bit of aid has actually made it down the pier. 3 U.S. soldiers have been injured in the process, I think probably being knocked around by the waves and things like that. But the Pentagon hasn't been exactly transparent how that's been possible. We also have U.S. troops effectively in Gaza. There was an image of a new U.S. anti-drone vehicle that's built on top of an MRAP, and they had that parked on the beach of Gaza. I guess Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin believes that as long as it's in a couple feet of water, then we don't technically have boots on the ground. They're just wet boots in Gaza, and that's somehow allowed. And so this pier has just turned into an absolute catastrophe, Tom. Almost no aid has gotten into the people, and it's cost the U.S. At this point, I think about $200 million.
That State Department spokesman or whatever, press secretary, was saying just the other day when he was asked about this that, we have no update, which I take to mean don't expect anything further from this boondoggle. So who really knows? I found it interesting, by the way, that Bernie Sanders, first of all, Bernie Sanders has been interesting on this because his supporters really, really let him have it for basically towing the party line, in favor of the Israeli point of view on this at the beginning, which they expected him to be more sympathetic to the other side. And he said, look, this is just such an atrocity. We have to understand that Israel needs to be able to do what it needs to do. And people just went nuts against him. And then all of a sudden, he started to change his tune. So I don't really know what's going on with Bernie. I feel like Bernie is a principled guy up to a point, but then when it comes time to vote for Hillary, that's what he'll do. And I wonder if that's what's going on here. But all the same, he recently said something like Netanyahu should not be permitted to address Congress. What do you make of Bernie?
Well, not very much, but at the same time, there's been so little action in Congress. And in fact, most of the action in Congress has been just to give more and more support to Israel. If Biden, say, holds up a 2,000-pound bomb shipment to Israel, Congress is going to demand that he resumes that and never restricts any aid to Israel ever again. That's what comes out of the Congress. And so by, I guess, the curve, Bernie is doing okay. He's unwilling to go and sit and listen to Netanyahu give a war speech to the U.S. Congress. He's willing to say we shouldn't be sending more weapons to Israel and that more aid needs to get to the Palestinians. But at the same time, I don't think this is an issue he likes to really highlight. And he's said that in speeches before when he was running for president, that this just really isn't something that we want to talk about. So I think that's generally his position on it. He'd rather not talk about it. But as you said, his supporters are, these formerly young college students who are still very progressive, and they see what's happening to the people of Gaza and they sympathize with them. And so they're demanding Bernie do the same. He's trying to do that somewhat.
Now, what about people who say the Gazans can stop this anytime they want? Anytime they want. All they got to do is let the hostages go, and then this whole thing ends. That's all they have to do. We are not asking for a lot. So just do that, and then this will all end. Well, isn't that reasonable?
Well, it's not exactly true, Tom, because from the very beginning, the Israelis have said that not only is their goal to rescue their hostages, but also to completely eliminate and eradicate Hamas, which the U.S. has explained, and even the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Charles Q. Brown, it basically explained is impossible because Israel is killing so many civilians in Gaza that we're having the insurgent effect here, where when you blow up an entire house, the AP just did a report where they looked at 10 different families and found something like 500 family members from just those 10 families have been killed by Israeli strikes. And so, it's just going to drive so much hatred and so many people to want to take up arms against Israel. Seeing the military path is the only solution to fighting the Israelis. And so there's really no way to eliminate Hamas. Additionally, you have a lot more members of the Israeli government. Now, they're from what the U.S. always calls the right-wing extremist in Israel, but they hold a lot of power in the government. Itamar Ben-Gvir, the leader of the Jewish Power Party, is the national security minister. So he holds a significant amount of sway in Israel. And they are calling for the complete eradication of the people of Gaza or dwindling the population from 2.3 million to 1 to 200,000 and then setting up Israeli settlements once again in Gaza. So an effective ethnic cleansing campaign. So I think for the people of Gaza, they probably feel like what little shield they do have from the Israeli strikes come from the fact that there are a few dozen Israelis left in Gaza.
Not too long ago, I had Sheldon Richman on, and Sheldon Richman is with the Libertarian Institute, and I'm sure you're familiar with him. And Sheldon is Jewish, and he says, he grew up, in an environment where that identity was taken very seriously, even if for him it's not quite as meaningful, but in his own family background, he understands it and he's sympathetic. But he's not in favor of the way the Israeli government is conducting matters in Gaza. But toward the end of our conversation, he said, I honestly don't know what to tell people over there. I don't know what advice to give people who live in Israel. Because on the one hand, he said, what they're doing is all wrong. But on the other, he said that the hatreds are now so embedded, I don't know what the solution is. Because I could understand, I understand the Palestinian position completely. I also understand the position of somebody who's lived in Israel for 50 years and says, maybe there were some injustices many years ago, but I'm just a regular person. I have no control over any of that. And meanwhile, I have to live with all the hatred and anger aimed at me. And I'm afraid that the more concessions I make to the other side, the more emboldened they'll become and the worse my life will be. I mean, what do you want me to do? And he really said, I just don't know the answer. Now, you don't have to know the quote, the answer in order to make a comment on something. If I see your house burning down, I can shout for help, even if I have no idea how to rebuild your house. So it's okay to still have a comment. But yet, I can understand very well people on the Israeli side saying, well, what kind of an answer is that? That you're telling us that we're doing it all wrong, but then you have nothing to say to us. So what do you have to say to an ordinary person living in Israel who genuinely has goodwill toward all mankind and just wants to live in peace and has no influence over the making of Israeli foreign policy? What do you say to them?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, Tom. And I guess the first thing I would say...
But by the way, you see, I'm putting you on the hot seat as the substitute Scott Horton on your very first appearance.
Well, I appreciate it. And I have a lot of respect for Sheldon Richman. I do work at the Libertarian Institute as well, so we are colleagues there. But with the first thing I would say to the Israeli is, look, I'm not really advising the Israeli government do anything. What I'm saying is I want my government to stop providing Israel the arms it needs to do this. And I think that's really going to force Tel Aviv to have to recalibrate and the Israelis to give up a lot of their militarism. They're going to have to learn to live with the other countries in their neighborhood, and they're not going to be able to bully around the Palestinians all the time. Even the Saudis are still willing to accept a deal that leads to normalization with Israel if Israel agrees to steps that lead to a two-state solution. And Israel's just completely unwilling to do that. Netanyahu has made that very clear. And so, that would be my first response. But I would also say that I really do empathize, and I understand that in the short run, there's been so much violence that there is going to continue to be more violence on both sides of this thing for the years to come. And that's one of the horrors of war and why you never choose war in the first place. And I would try to point it out to that person that, look, you're putting yourself in a position here where all you could do is kill, 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 or you feel like you're going to be killed. Are you really willing to commit a genocide? There's 1 million children in Gaza. Are you willing to kill all of them to get what you want, to get the safety that you say is the most important thing to you? And of course, how much hostility is that going to create towards Israel? And can it survive if it does commit this genocide and it's isolated from the rest of the world? Israel is a very small country, and more European nations are recognizing Palestine as a state as a way of saying that we really don't like what Israel is doing right now in Gaza. And then I think the other point, Tom, is that if Israel wants to be a state that controls from the river to the sea, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, and the Palestinian people there, it has to recognize that it has to be a state of all of its people. In 2019, Prime Minister Netanyahu explained when he passed the Jewish nation state law that Israel is not a state of all of its people, meaning the Palestinians, the Christians, the Bedouins, the Druze. The state is not for them. The state is built for the Jews and to be a sanctuary and a growing place for the Jewish people, which means everybody else is a second class, and you just can't operate a state like that.
Folks, in this day and age, there are a lot of competing demands for your time, and a lot of them are a complete waste of your time, unlike the Tom Woods Show. Well, I have an excellent way to deal with it all. With the Blinkist app, you can absorb huge amounts of information in 27 nonfiction categories, just about anything you could be interested in. So we're talking history, technology, career, philosophy, parenting, religion, and on and on. Blinkist takes each of these books, condenses it down to that 15-minute core you absolutely need to know, and you can read or listen to these 15-minute summaries. So a half-hour commute each way means the equivalent of 4 books consumed. And then you can decide, do I want to read this whole book, or was this really all I pretty much needed from that? Well, among the thousands and thousands of titles at Blinkist, you'll even find libertarian classics. You'll find works by Milton Friedman, Murray Rothbard, and even Ol Woods. Well, right now, Blinkist has a special offer just for our audience. Go to Blinkist.com/Woods to start your 7-day free trial and get 40% off a Blinkist premium membership. That's Blinkist, spelled Blinkist, Blinkist.com/Woods to get 40% off and a 7-day free trial. Blinkist.com/Woods. Now, for a limited time, you can even use Blinkist Connect to share your premium account. You'll get 2 premium subscriptions for the price of 1. How is it possible that different groups of people seem to see different things happening in what's happening in Gaza? That we have one side saying that it's an outright genocide occurring, and we have another side either claiming this is overblown, or saying that there's a false moral equivalence being drawn, or arguing that there's really no moral problem with what Israel is doing. How does the average person with no prior knowledge here evaluate these 2 different claims?
Right. I mean, I think when it comes to the word genocide, there's what people think, and then the international definition of genocide that creates some of the differences here. When people think of genocide, they really just think of 1944, 1945 Germany, where they're just marching the Jews into the gas chambers and killing all of them. But in reality, what the international definition is the destruction of a people. And so when you talk about destroying all the hospitals, the mosques, the schools, 50% of the homes in Gaza, people who say that that's an ethnic cleansing campaign, that's a genocide, really do have a point under the international law. But for the people who think the word genocide means that any Israeli soldier is going to shoot any Palestinian that they see in Gaza, well, that isn't actually what's happening in Gaza. And so I think that's a part of it. And then how people consume media, I think, is a big part of the difference here too. If you just watch the mainstream news, they don't show you the pictures of the Palestinian kids with their heads blown off and just all the other absolute horrors. These kids who are laying in hospital beds, having daily treatment because they have 3rd-degree burns all over their bodies and also don't have anesthesia, or all these kids with no legs and things like that people just don't see if they watch the mainstream media, but they do if they look at social media. I think also explains a lot of the discrepancy.
What do you think is going on right now in terms of public support for the government of Israel? Because I ask that because it seems like the 2 sides on this are both digging in their heels to the point where the pro-Israel side is becoming much, much more militantly so, and vice versa, and the Palestinian side likewise. But let's say, leaving aside people who are traditionally interested in this topic, and just think about, again, the general American public, that they vaguely know there's some kind of thing in the Middle East that it seems to be a problem, but they don't really know any of the details. They do know that it does seem to involve their own government quite a bit. Where do you think this is moving public opinion, if at all?
I do think public opinion, particularly for younger Americans, is skewing more and more towards the Palestinians, being favorable to them, and at least wanting to cut off U.S. military aid to Israel, if not outright changing the U.S. relationship with Israel and condemning Israel as an apartheid state that's in the midst of a genocide, and wanted to see Israeli leaders tried for war crimes at the International Criminal Court. So if you look at polling from October 7th on, sympathy with Palestinians, particularly among younger Americans, those under 35, has grown quite substantially, and support for Israel has plummeted. This seems to be less true as you get older and older in the age brackets, although it's not like Israel is really picking up a lot of public support. Even about 50% of Republicans, and this has been true for the past 4 months or so, have said that it's time to see a ceasefire in Gaza.
That's also been my impression. But then I would say, in addition to that, an organization like the ADL, I think had been, I think some people had feared it, but by and large, I think it had I would say it had fairly high favorability ratings because people assumed, well, this is just an organization trying to prevent gross injustices against Jewish people and mischaracterizations and whatever. But I think in just the past few years, as people have seen the way that organization behaves, that it's just like the Southern Poverty Law Center. It's just the way it acts is just like any leftist organization would act, even though the ADL and AIPAC will, from time to time, support a Republican politician as long as he has the right position on Israel. But particularly after the way they've treated, AIPAC treated Thomas Massie and the ADL, when anybody with a brain, with two brain cells to rub together, can see Massie's a really smart guy who's very principled. He doesn't single Israel out, and we can all see that is exactly like Ron Paul. I think these organizations that, again, had been at least neutral in the public eye, suddenly they're not used to being held up to scrutiny or mocked as they are increasingly being, and I think that's a change.
Yeah, and I agree with you, especially when it seems to come to the ADL. It seems that the Trump years and the anti-woke movement that emerged on the right, and the right kind of being the side that's most likely to pull the anti-Semitism card when it comes to Israel, that's really had something of a neutering effect on the anti-Semitism and cries that any criticism of Israel are anti-Semitic. But that's only kind of true of the general public. If you look at Congress, the House passed a bill that adopts the International Holocaust Museum's definition of anti-Semitism. That includes not being critical of other states when you're being critical of Israel. So if you say criticize what Israel is doing in Gaza, you have to at the same time criticize what's going on in Sudan or what happened in Burma, or else you're being anti-Semitic according to that definition. Again, that's been passed in the House as a bill. So that's pretty disturbing. And AIPAC still seems to have a lot of influence. It was great to see Thomas Massie defeat the AIPAC candidate in his district. But I actually went to college, and I went to Carthage College, which is a really small school in Kenosha, Wisconsin.
Oh, yeah, where Yuri Maltsev used to teach.
Yep. And I went to school there with a young woman, and AIPAC poured $500,000 into Daniel Davis's re-election campaign and ran a whole bunch of ads about how she is anti-Semitic to help defeat her. And she lost pretty substantially in her race. That's Keena Collins.
Wow, how about that? So what is it? Tell me. I've been following antiwar.com since the 1990s. I think they bought the domain in 1995. In fact, I think Eric may have bought the domain. And if I remember the story correctly, the late Justin Raimondo, at that time, with the internet so new, didn't even really fully appreciate the significance of snagging the domain antiwar.com, which, thank goodness, otherwise it could have wound up in the hands of extremely irritating people who have 157 terrible opinions in addition to anti-war. But it's had, as far as I can see, it's never been changed. It's the same format that it's had all these years. What would you say is the primary merit of antiwar.com, and why should we visit it every day?
Yeah, and as you mentioned, it hasn't changed much over the years, and that's, I think, one of the great things is every day there's news at antiwar.com, and that's typically our news editor, Dave DeCamp, writing news stories. So anything that gets published in Reuters about the wars going on in Gaza or Ukraine, Dave will do a write-up on it, but he removes all the mainstream spin out of the article so people can really get facts and find out what's happening. And then he provides the real context that you need to know to put things in perspective. Right now, Dave's on vacation, so I'm filling in there. So if you go to antiwar.com this week or next week, it'll be pretty much all me in the news section. And then we also do an opinion section, a viewpoint section every day at antiwar.com. And that's what I put together. And that's a collection of the most important viewpoints, op-eds from around the anti-war movement. It doesn't matter if you're a libertarian, a conservative, a Republican, a Democrat. We'll run the article as long as it's strong anti-war. And so I think that's a lot of our importance, is just being kind of the hub of the anti-war movement, the anti-imperialist movement, and making sure people have one place they could go to get not only all the news, but a lot of the important opinions being shared as well.
I remember very distinctly, all the way back in 2003 during the Iraq War, I was on antiwar.com multiple times a day, just thirsting for information, because I remember I've just felt sick over that war. I just couldn't imagine that people had gone for this, and just the destruction that was being meted out was incredible. And of course, this is being done in my name, because they all talk about we and America this and America that, and I ain't America. I'm just some guy, and I don't want to have any part of this. And I just needed information, and I didn't know where I could, what sources I could trust. I mean, maybe some international sources were helpful, but other than that, it was hard to know. And to have antiwar.com with its commentary and its curation of the news, which was very important, helped get us all through that. So I never forgot that was the source I knew I could go to. So I'm glad it continues to. I mean, I guess next year would be 30 years of antiwar.com. How about that? Really very important service that has been provided to all of us. And over the years, I've been an on-again, off-again donor to antiwar.com, and I feel like that has been money particularly well spent. So having said all that, Kyle, thanks so much for your time. This is our first time. Have we ever met before?
No, I don't believe so, Tom.
Okay, because I was about to say this is our first time talking, and then sometimes people will contradict me and say, well, actually, back in 2008, you signed my book. So I just wanted to make sure it wasn't anything like that. But I'm glad to have a chance to get to know you, and maybe we can do this again in the future.
Sounds great, Tom. Thank you so much for having me on.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com, and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.